the World Food Programme was established in the early 60s. 1961 were the very first activities, but 1963 when the organization started to really come into its own. It actually was born out of the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and indeed we're still actually linked in some ways to FAO as well. It was set up to try and combat global hunger, more for the people who are hungry, whereas FAO worked more on the agricultural and the production side. Since then it's expanded rapidly. We're working in over 80 countries now, and we are one of the biggest humanitarian organizations in the world. In fact, the biggest in the food security sector. In some ways, I think the situation was a little bit simpler in the 1960s because it was more lack of development, agricultural crises, famines, droughts, this sort of thing. And that's what WFP set up to do. Now the situation is much more complicated because in many ways some of the worst food insecurity, either people who haven't got enough to eat, either quantity or quality or variety, is actually in countries that are often quite developed, countries where you've got a huge extreme between people very rich, maybe also some high-tech industries going on, but you have this underlayer of extremely poor, very vulnerable people who can't make enough food, who can't get hold of enough food for themselves and their families. This makes it much more difficult because it's much more nuanced in what you're trying to do, to go into countries that maybe actually have quite a good GDP or GNP, but still assist the most vulnerable. So we see that our work is really changing, whereas it used to be a lot of distribution of food. Now actually we do a lot more with cash and with vouchers, like here in Turkey, which is right because the markets can cope with it, the choice is there, it stimulates the local economies and it gives back a benefit to the countries, like in Turkey where it's hosting lots of refugees. The retail economy benefits from the fact that everybody shops here, buying Turkish grown, Turkish sold products. But what we're also having to do is to work a lot more with national governments, with national organizations, so that they understand the concept of food insecurity, they understand what needs to be done, how it needs to be addressed. So our work has really evolved a lot compared with the 1960s. I think it's more challenging. I think it's probably also more interesting. I think that our role is multifaceted. I mean, obviously one part of the role is actually helping people who don't have enough to eat and to make sure that they are not hungry. Another part is actually working with the government national systems and structures that overall poverty is reduced. If people have enough to eat, there's very clear correlations with going to school. The more people go to school, the less likely they are to be caught in the poverty trap, particularly for girls. And so everywhere you look, there's some sort of connection between food. And so we work with government, we work with policies, we work with development structures, and we actually work with food distribution, whether we distribute the food itself or we give people the means to go and buy the food, like with the cash and the vouchers. Here in 2012 responding to the Syrian refugees who've come in. But in fact we've been active in Turkey for quite a long time. We had a big base here supporting Iraq operations during the Iraq Gulf War. And Turkey is actually our single biggest country for buying food. So where we distribute food in kind, as we call it, i.e. we actually give out the flour or the lentils or whatever, we buy a lot of that in Turkey. So we've always had a big procurement presence here. Operational activities here in Turkey, we started in 2012 working with AFAD in all the camps that the government was setting up for the Syrian refugees. And then in 2015, when we got some EU funding, we started to move into helping people outside the camps, but only in the southeast, in the Gaziantep, Kilis, Urfa, Hatay area. Now, since last year, 2016, we've actually got this big project that we are rolling out in partnership with the government, particularly the Ministry of Family, but also AFAD, DGMM, the Migration Management, and the Civil Registration. And we're implementing with the Turkish Red Crescent, Kızılay, and it's all funded by the European Union, ECHO. And this will reach up to 1 million people, maybe even more, across all of Turkey. And this is the first time there's been a major assistance program for the Syrian refugees, and indeed for refugees from other countries like Afghanistan or Palestine, that can be done over the whole of Turkey. I think one of the things that we're trying to do with this emergency social safety net, or the social coherence program as the government here likes to call it, is to be an embodiment of the grand bargain from the World Humanitarian Summit that was held in Istanbul in May. What's different about that is that, or one of the things at least that's different, is working in partnership with local organizations. So obviously we have a very strong partnership with the government, and particularly for implementation, the Ministry of Family. We have a very strong partnership with Kızılay, the Red Crescent, who's been our partner right since the beginning of 2012. And now we need to expand that network and work more, even if it's not for direct implementation, but certainly collaboratively, cooperatively with various other organizations, whether it's NGOs, whether it's the Mokhtas, the imams, the kaymakams, all these different levels. And this is something that we're really building now. In order to do this, we're actually setting up different field offices. So whereas before we had Ankara, Gaziantep, Urfa and Hatay, now we're expanding to have offices in Mersin, in Izmir, and Istanbul.